It's okay.
So am I.
It's okay. If you want to slow down, I'll talk to you more.
Hey guys, I'm Alex.
I'm Jason, we're the Table Monkeys, and this is going to be a continuation of our programming video. But first, we just want to thank NoLimits.com for our new attire, very sick shirts. It did take a while due to the whole COVID thing, but we got them eventually. Pretty awesome. So we're quickly, obviously, as we've done throughout this series, we're just going to recap a little bit. What we've talked about before are the goals and the checkpoints. And inside the goal, you have the 3 phases, and then we also started defining workload and volume and intensity and all that stuff and how it changes depending on what phase you're in. But from week to week and day to day, what you have to do is the work, and that's what this video is going to be about.
Exactly. So, and the work is just comprised of exercises, movements that you do on a daily basis, a weekly basis.
Exactly.
And the movements get broken down into compound exercises and isolation exercises. So we're going to cover those now so we can...
as we've done in the other videos, just start defining them so that we can talk about them a little bit more in-depthly. So compound exercises are multi-joint exercises, most commonly thought of as your squat, your bench, your deadlift, your overhead press, and maybe your clean. But let's just say squat, bench, deadlift, overhead
Those
press.
are the big ones.
Those are the big ones. But with arm wrestling, we're not going to do those kind of movements as much, and we're going to break the body parts down a little bit more, and sort of the same way like a bodybuilder would. So a compound arm movement for a bodybuilder would be like a big heavy standing curl. That's something where he's going to be so the other thing with the compound movements is, and we're going to talk about this stuff later, is that they really affect your whole CNS. They get a whole chain going, and they're just like a deeper sort of effect on your whole body.
Yeah, so like you can do a bench press, for example, where the main target is your pecs, but if you do it enough, your shoulders and your triceps will also grow and get stronger.
And even your back, just from pulling the bar down once you get really big.
Exactly. So they're like a great bang for your buck in terms of what movement you're going to do.
Or like the overhead press, which we've preached a lot. That's another great example where your back is definitely involved, your core, your hips even. Like it's a whole body movement, and it's a full kinetic chain the same way a squat is a very long kinetic chain or a deadlift.
So speaking of like chains, like an arm wrestling chain could be a compound exercise like a pronation curl where you're involving your elbow joint and your wrist joint to connect like a back pressure pronation movement, which you would do on the table.
Yeah, that's the big thing that you want to think about when you're thinking about compound movements is the chain and how it relates to the sport. So like Alex just said there, or maybe it's the cup to drag chain, like that's a big chain that works together. So you're going to work that with big heavy, like we've talked about the PVC pipe pulls. That's something that's going to connect your cup to your bicep, to your lat, to your tricep, to all that pulling. It's going to make one long chain doing that movement together. So that's more of a compound movement where something like
just a straight wrist curl would be an isolation exercise. It's one joint, it's one muscle group.
Right. So I guess that's the next thing, right, is to define isolation. Is that isolation movements are exactly that. They're where you start to isolate a certain muscle group or joint. So with a standing bicep curl where my shoulder's involved and my elbow's involved, even just now putting it where my elbow's resting on a preacher curl bench and my shoulder and my back and my hip and all that is out of the movement, and now it's just isolated to my elbow joint and my wrist joint. That's now a form of an isolation movement, right? And then again, like Alex said, you can even go further and just isolate the wrist joint,
So isolation exercises will give you more specific work to the area that you're working, but they'll only work that muscle. They won't work the other ones. So it's a trade-off.
Yeah, and it's a great way to manage your fatigue throughout the week is when like your forearms can take a lot more of a beating than your bicep tendon can. Sometimes it's a good idea to take your bicep out of wrist curl movements so that your bicep can get some rest and your forearms can still get that work.
Exactly. Compound exercises are just naturally more fatiguing than isolation exercises.
Right, and the big thing that this relates to is, as far as the work goes, is you're going to manipulate whether you're using compound or isolation movements, and then the rep range and the intensity, so your volume and your intensity, to manipulate how much work you're doing or whether you're affecting your strength, your power, your endurance, your hypertrophy.
Right, so let's move on to this pyramid, because we love pyramids.
Exactly. They seem to work, they seem to explain things, and there's always a hierarchy. There's always a hierarchy in things.
And it all connects.
Yeah, so that's why they work so well. The big thing here, the reason that it explains it well, hypertrophy, we're going to use that as the base of the pyramid. That's the size of the muscle. And then strength is the peak of the pyramid. That's your ability to access those muscle fibers.
Right, because the bigger the muscle is, the more potential it has to get stronger. Not necessarily a bigger muscle is a stronger muscle,
right,
but it does have more potential to become one.
Yeah, exactly. So somebody who, let's say, is, you know, that's that smaller guy who doesn't seem to be that big, but is just like ridiculously strong. Well, the strength is his ability to use all of his muscle fibers and use them to their full potential. So as someone like that adds size to those muscles, the neurological adaptation to use the fibers is still there. Mm-hmm. Because one of the things you got to understand about muscles is that you don't add fibers to your body. You have the muscle fibers you have, and then they either get bigger or they get stronger by neurological connection, where they become more able to fire at a higher rate.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And then there's power and endurance. So
power is obviously the ability to move quickly, and endurance is the ability to hold close to a max amount of power for an extended period of time.
Yeah, exactly.
Both super important for arm wrestling.
Yeah.
And they can be trained very differently.
And they both are a product of strength,
exactly.
Right? So your absolute strength is going to determine your power, and your absolute strength is going to determine your endurance. Basically, your power is how quickly you can get to your absolute strength, and endurance is how long you can hold as close to your absolute strength.
Yeah.
Just to make it simple.
But the rep ranges and intensity ranges for all four of these differ quite a lot, and also depending on which muscle group you're training them for. So let's just give some practical examples of rep ranges and intensity ranges for all four of these different types of training.
All right, so give me one for strength.
So strength is the ability to produce maximal force, and it's usually trained or tested with a 1 rep max, but that's not necessarily the best way to train for it. We believe the best way to train for strength is an intensity range above 75%, doing 4 to 6 reps for 4 to 6 sets, so rep range like 15 to 25.
Yeah, exactly. And then if you think about power, for example, how that's going to differ from strength, because a lot of people are going to think about that as being the same thing. What power is how quickly you can get to absolute force production. So again, a lot of people test that and train that with a lower rep range and higher intensity, and that is correct for power, and that's where that kind of confusion happens. You know, people think they're training their strength, but they're actually training their power and their explosiveness because they're going too heavy with too low reps. And if you try to do that too much, you're just going to get hurt. So the best rep range for power is somewhere around 85 to 90% for intensity, and 1 to 3 reps for 2 to 4 sets. Total rep range somewhere between like 8 and 12 total reps.
Right. And the big difference between training for strength and training for power is that when you're training for strength, you're going close to failure.
Yeah.
You're not worried about speed necessarily. But when you're doing power, you're
trying to move heavy weight quickly.
Yeah, exactly.
Like the weight's got to be heavy enough that it requires you to access all your force output, but the objective is to move it quickly and only a few times.
Yeah.
And then what about hypertrophy?
So hypertrophy training is training to specifically grow your muscle size. And this is best achieved by doing tons of work at a good enough intensity, breaking down the muscle and allowing it to regrow. So that intensity range is going to be between 60 and 80%. Any lower than that, and you're probably just training endurance, and you're not getting a good enough stimulus to adapt to hypertrophy. And if you go higher than that, you're not going to be able to do enough volume, and you're going to fry your CNS so quickly. So we're looking at an intensity range between 60 and 80%, and a total rep range between 30 and 50 reps, split up into like 3 to 6 sets.
Yeah. And then finally, endurance is basically your ability to maintain your maximum force production, or at least as close to it, for as long as possible. Especially in arm wrestling, I mean, for different sports, obviously, it might be a much moderate intensity level, but for arm wrestling, it's a pretty high intensity level that you got to maintain for an extended period of time to be effective. So that's how we're going to reference it or talk about training it for for arm wrestling. And the main way to do that is going to be time under tension or shorter rest periods. So whether that's doing a superset and then reducing the amount of time between your supersets from, let's say you start with 3 minutes working, 3 minutes resting, and then you try to reduce that down to a minute over the course of a few months, so you got 3 minutes working, 1 minute resting. That's going to be, your endurance levels are going to be high at that point. And then the other way would be like Alex was saying, a lower intensity range, so somewhere in that 50% range, but a lot of time under tension. So slower reps, tempo reps, eccentrics, isometric holds. For isometrics, we like to train more power, especially, or more strength, especially because of the arm wrestling. So those we're going to do like more in the 80 to 90% range for like between 5 and 15 seconds, or 10 to 20 seconds, but not much more than 20 seconds. And if you think about most arm wrestling matches, even like ruling battles, they don't usually go longer than 20 or 30 seconds, except for a few exceptions where they're 5 minutes. Yeah, Jerry and Todd kind of thing. So yeah, that like less than 20 seconds, more than 80% range for endurance as far as static holds go, or time under tension for, let's say, more than 20 seconds and less than 50% or around 50% or less.
So training for these 4 things is going to break down your muscles, your tendons, and your CNS. And they all fatigue at different rates and from different things. So programming really is about balancing the fatigue that you get from each of those things.
And you balance the fatigue with recovery, time, and frequency of workouts. And as Alex said, that's the beauty of setting up the programs. But that is what we're going to cover next week in our final programming video, where right now Alex is at the beginning of an accumulation phase and I'm right in the middle of a transmutation and realization phase. So we're going to give you the 2 examples of what we're doing, how it differs, the rep ranges, and just explain it all with the actual programs that we're using right now.
Yeah, so that was the end of the video. We hope you liked it. And if you did, please leave us a like.
Leave feedback in the comments section. Subscribe for new videos.
And we'll catch you next time.
Monkeys out.
Peace.
Go! Oh, and that hook, honey,